sometime later. And it was founded after severe flooding on the Delaware River that greatly impacted Easton and greatly impacted a hotel that the foundation owned a few blocks down the street. And its mission was to address issues related to the flooding, but it's since expanded to closely related issues, but broadened and involved, and today does two types of work. One, we do research about how to improve communications about severe weather events, and improve resiliency about that. And it's also the community center that you are in and has very much loved in Easton, where we have conferences and presentations and films and wonderful art exhibits about the environment and improving resiliency and all the issues that are among those most important issues of our time that Dad was inspired about. When I first became involved in my dad's work in 2007, Andy had already been reporting about the environment for some time. He began, in fact, before the Earth Summit in 1991, he was already an environmental journalist. By 2007, when NNC was founded, he had already been with the New York Times for more than a decade. He had authored 3 books already on issues from the Amazon to the Arctic, and Dad knew him and enormously admired him. Since then, Andy has worked for Politico. He also had started right around that time his very popular .Earth blog for the New York Times. Then he went on and worked for the Politico. He was a senior fellow in environmental understanding at Pace, and then he became a strategic advisor on environment and science journalism at National Geographic. And more recently, just a few months ago, he became head of a communication initiative called the Initiative on Communication and Sustainability at Columbia University, and that's where he is now. Dad died in 2010. I remember vividly the last time I saw Andy because it was about 3 days before Dad passed away. Andy was lecturing at Pace as a part of his work there, and Dad was pretty feeble. He was in a wheelchair. He had actually been in the hospital already. We knew he was in his last days, and I asked if he felt up to going to it. He didn't hesitate a second. He was so enthusiastic, and he was so determined to be there, no matter what it took. So I remember that very well, and I remember him sitting riveted during Andy's talk. And that's, Dad didn't live to see what NNC became. This building didn't open their doors to the public until 2011. Dad died in 2010. He would have been so gratified to see what it is today, but he would have been most of all so thrilled to have Andy and Lisa here lecturing to the community here in Easton about, of all things, weather, which is what got us started and which is so fundamental to what we are. And on his behalf, I am gratified. And I will tell you, because Andy may not, that book is wonderful. It is so readable. It is so accessible. It is really worth getting. So welcome, Andy, and thank you so much for coming.
Wow, it's a pleasure to be here and to learn even a few more details about Ted and the family and your continuing commitment to community empowerment as a path to environmental sustainability, which is a big chunk of what I'm doing now at Columbia University. I've been a storyteller essentially for 35 years, telling you the state of the planet in one way or the other. And what grew substantially out of Ted's thinking as I absorbed it when I first met him in the early 2000s or so, maybe even earlier, was his work in labor mediation, his work in fostering constructive discourse among entities that are just locked in battle, has felt ever more relevant to pursuing progress on climate change, or let alone vaccination or nuclear power or every aspect of these tough issues we deal with. If you think that storytelling is the path to success, then you're missing these opportunities to do a lot more listening, which is what journalists actually, considering that reporting is supposedly listening, most of the time when a journalist is interviewing somebody, it's to get a quote, some little sharp comment that fits a preconception in the journalist's story, as opposed to actually listening. So transitioning from telling a better story to shaping a better conversation is a big part of sustainability and communication going forward. And I'm lucky enough to be married to a woman who's doing that at the classroom level, empowering teachers to enable learning, not to be the professor. Professing is a verb. I profess to you. So we're on a frontier now. That is also not so new. Old town meetings in New England or this part of New York State were all about listening, and at least hopefully. And we have to get back to that in some ways if we want to have success. So this book is about weather and climate. You can't have one without the other. Climate is average weather over a period of time, and that average changes, and climate change is the change in weather patterns. And weather exists within a climate system. As this book, when we were first, a publisher first approached me with the idea of doing this book, like 5 or 6 or 7 years earlier, I had held off for a little while, but finally, they wanted a book of 100 moments in the history of of weather science. That was the initial idea. And I thought, well, where do you start? And so we started with, how did the Earth get an atmosphere? Because you can't have weather or climate without an atmosphere. So this book begins 4.56 billion years ago is roughly when the planet got its first atmosphere. Then along came the moon. There was this collision, the grand collision in the early solar system that shredded away the initial atmosphere, and the moon was born out of that collision. And there's still lots of uncertainty about how that played out. Then Earth had to build a new atmosphere, and then finally we got moving. But I'm going to give you a little bit of a framing before we talk about the book specifically. And I really loved digging in on. I was trying to think about the context of where we are with climate change, CO2-driven global warming, in the context of our journey so far as a species. And to me, the core notion at the heart of the book is that through 99.9% of human history, a million or 2 years back through the hominids, the weather and climate did stuff to us. It was a one-way relationship. And then we figured out, we put on clothes, we moved into a cave, we migrated, or we died. And that's kind of like, but it was always the system doing things to us. And now the new part of our journey is we've reached a point now that we've moved from 1 billion people in the year 1800 to heading toward 9 billion people by 2050, doing a lot of things, burning a lot of fuels, taking down forests, changing oceans. We're now in a two-way relationship with the system, the Earth system, for the first time. And that's a big transition. And to some extent, that also gives me a little bit more comfort in thinking about why it's confusing and contentious. It's because it's such a profound change to have had this relationship with this system that was basically, do we carry an umbrella today? And now we're modifying the system in ways with huge consequences going forward in time. And there's also innovation is this amazing thread through this whole process, this journey.
Of the hurricane, right?
And here,
You can see it very clearly on the radar. A beautiful picture from our radar area in there.
anyone recognize that voice, the older folks in the room?
If you're available, fine.
It's Dan Rather.
All right, fine.
1961, he was like a 20-something TV reporter in KHOU in Houston, and Hurricane Carla was heading toward the coast. And Dan, apparently, I checked this out pretty thoroughly. He is the person who said, hey, you got this radar thing here. It shows the hurricane. Can we put the map of Texas on there? Like, can we add the map? So Dan Rather was a multimedia reporter doing infographics. He was the person who first I figured out how to have a broadcast that has the map of the state with the radar signal coming toward the state. I thought it was kind of interesting to think about that. And you'll see through the journey in the book, and just the journey of our relationship with the system has had these bursts of innovation. The chart on the right is carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere since 1750. It's a gas that accumulates. It's not like smoke coming out of a smokestack. It doesn't. Once you burn a chunk of coal that's been in the ground for millions of years, you release the carbon dioxide, and it's a gas that hangs around. It might go into a tree for 100 years, through photosynthesis, then the tree dies and it is liberated again. So it's like adding to this pulse of heat trapping property in the atmosphere. And it's more like accumulating credit card debt than like old-fashioned pollution, which you could just put a filter on to stop. With this, it's, as anyone here who's had debt, you know that slowing your spending does not cut your debt. Right? Slowing your spending slows the accumulation of debt. You have to go to zero. You have to pay off the debt. So CO2, we have to either find ways to capture a lot of it and put it back in the ground, or cut emissions so deeply that nature can start to take that level down in the atmosphere. So it's again, a fundamentally new kind of problem we hadn't had to deal with before. My journey is also a learning journey. You know, humans in the climate system have been figuring things out for a long time. As a journalist, I started out just being interested in the world, and the phrase that comes to mind, I'm just one of these people who, when I was a kid even, I was always like, I wouldn't say a gossip, but the words, "Did you hear that?" ... I was always saying, "Did you hear that?" So that's the journalist in me. I think I'd wanted to go into science, but I was too much of a "did you hear that" kind of person. I had to share what I was learning about the world. And so that got me out on the road, and it's taken me all over the world. And you'll hear more about Lisa's journey as a teacher, too, in a few minutes. And I did get to go to the North Pole.
Time in the history
And it was this made me,
attain the North Pole.
my trip to the North Pole really was my trip toward multimedia reporting and toward thinking about interactively. While I was on the sea ice, this is ice that's, floating on the ocean at the North Pole, unlike Antarctica, which is a continent. So we were landing an airplane on sea ice at the North Pole, ice that's on a deep ocean. And while I was there, an editor at the New York Times, a young woman who was a website editor, she suggested that we do a reader Q&A. In the old days, a reporter, I would go to the North Pole with my pad and my pencil. You can't take pens because the ink freezes, I learned, at 20 below zero. So don't take a pen when you go to the North Pole. So we did a reader Q&A. On the website, they put up something that said, "Hey, Andy Revkin is on the sea ice at the North Pole. Ask some questions." And people were emailing questions. I had a satellite phone, and she would narrate the questions to me, and I would give her some answers. So even as I was reporting a story that ran in the printed paper, 2003, I was already thinking about taking video and interacting with readers, which was, again, a conversation, a fundamentally new way of doing journalism, actually listening to readers, as opposed to just blathering at them. I was getting ahead of myself a little bit in the sense that I started out as a traditional writer and editor at magazines back in the day. My first story on the climate system was actually about nuclear winter. At the peak of the Cold War, when Soviet Union and the United States were poised to incinerate each other with nuclear warheads, science had emerged that, well, if we burn enough cities in a nuclear war, not only would the war be a catastrophe, but you'd have this catastrophic impact on the climate. The inverse of global warming. It would actually chill things dangerously. It would not become cartoonish like a frozen ice cube Earth. That's the way the media works sometimes. We show you the Earth in an ice cube to make you think about nuclear winter. In fact, around the time I was writing that story, some of the first scientists studying this idea had started to run more sophisticated analysis of the smoke and what would happen after a nuclear war. And it turned out, as they said in one paper, it would be more like nuclear autumn. But where's your cover story in nuclear autumn? Can you imagine Walter Cronkite of the newscast? They've just determined there will be a nuclear autumn after nuclear war. It just didn't have the heft to it. So that issue kind of went on a back shelf for a while. Although, believe it or not, there's been recent studies showing that even if just India and Pakistan, which are both nuclear-armed states, if they have an exchange of, if they have a nuclear battle, that could chill the climate enough to disrupt global agriculture for about 10 years. So it's still an issue. 1988 was my first big article about global warming. And so here you have sort of the bracketed views of how we can affect the climate system. And similarly, overly dramatized, like some of the accounts these days that have really been overstating what we're facing. The 12-year ticking clock is just not what science shows. We can talk about that later. But this was sort of my journey forward. 1989, I went to the Amazon and wrote my first book about the murder of Chico Mendes, who was a Brazilian rainforest leader who was assassinated by cattle ranchers. And by the way, the burning back then was much more extensive than it has been this past year. You probably saw some pretty breathless headlines about unprecedented Amazon burning. Not even close. Which says a lot about the media, too. We have a very short time span. And words like unprecedented get thrown around too loosely, especially in the what I call the Instanet. The Instanet is all about now and catching eyeballs and not worrying about context as much. But that story revealed some pretty important realities about most environmental stories at their heart are social issues. The forces causing the deforestation pulse in the Amazon were very complex. It ranged from a military government in the 70s and 80s wanting to do the normal thing countries like to do, build roads so we can occupy this big part of Brazil that has hardly any people in it. That was a big part of the philosophy. The ranchers there in the middle of the 20th century were no different than our cattle ranchers being sent with manifest destiny into the West in the United States in the 1800s. And when I was in Brazil, in the forest, reporting that story, the ranchers there were very quick to say, yeah, well, you guys did all the same stuff, 150 years ago, 100 years ago. And it made it that was an interesting revelation as well. And one thing that I've learned, even though I've been covering climate particularly, is that if you look at the graphs of greenhouse gases and you're not looking at the full picture of human influence on planetary systems, you're missing that there's something much more profound afoot here. This relates to what I said a minute ago about us moving from 1 billion people in 1800 to a world now where there's more than 1 billion teenagers on the planet, just teenagers. There's 7.7 billion people right now. And just think about 1 billion teenagers. Just that one factoid, let that float in your head for a second. And I think you've all been a teenager, even if you haven't had a teenager as a kid. So that's it says a lot about this pulse of influence we've had on the Earth system so far. We've been in that teenage mode of, wow, look, a forest. Oh, wow, a whole lake full of fish. Zoom, we take the fish. And fossil fuels have given us this unbelievable potency. You can make fertilizer with fossil fuel. You can mobilize, you can industrialize. You can do so much with that power density that comes in a lump of coal or a gallon of gasoline. It's just incredible. So it's not surprising that we've been in surge mode. These are graphs for everything from water use, paper production, marine fish capture, and nearly all of them have had this zoomy quality. And the good news is some of them are modulating, and actually these are from about 5 years ago. There's actually work underway that's shown that we're hitting peak travel, that as you get richer, you don't just keep flying more and more and more, that there are limits even to our indulgences. And we're getting way more production out of less land. I wrote some pieces on Snot Earth, my blog, 5 or 6 years ago about data showing that we've already hit peak farmland, meaning if you get more production from less land, you don't have to keep taking down new forests. And that's a trend even in Brazil, although it's being reversed a little bit right now, obviously under President Bolsonaro. In 1992, I wrote my second book and my first book on global warming. And this got me, it pulled me into the scholarship world, even though I've never really been a scholar. I'm a journalist. But I wrote in 1992 that the Holocene, which is the name for the geological period since the last ice age, so the last 11,700 years, that's when the ice sheets began pulling back from us here. We were all under the ice here, if you were here 13,000 years ago. From then till now, we've been in this kind of equable, comfortable climate for the most part. Lots of bumps and ups and downs. I wrote that we had left the Holocene and we were heading into a geological age of our own making, which gets back to what I was saying earlier about this new relationship we have with the planet. This is the first time there have been species in planetary history before that have changed the atmosphere, profoundly changed the planet. About 2 billion years ago, blue-green algae, cyanobacteria, began photosynthesizing. Photosynthesis was a new idea in nature at that time. And the atmosphere had been low oxygen. The oceans were anaerobic. And then suddenly the world was becoming oxygenated. And it was catastrophic because all of the life forms that had evolved on Earth in the early billion years had thrived in an environment without oxygen. So now suddenly these emergent bacteria and plankton and then plants were producing a lot of oxygen, and changes everything. And it, of course, enabled the life journey that has brought us around too. But there's some, in the book I think I mentioned that some geologists call that the great oxygen catastrophe, which is, again, now it seems weird because we wouldn't be hanging out here talking if we didn't have oxygen. But Earth has had that before. The difference now is that a species has become a planetary force, we have, and is at least becoming aware of it. You know, we have brains, and we're looking at the environment with science and numbers, and we're saying, wow, we're actually really powerful, and we're changing things in ways that will last for millenniums to come. And what do we do about that? And that's why we're in this discourse right now, and that's why it's difficult sometimes for people to talk about it. And then, as I said earlier, then I got into this weird thing, the ecosystem of news. Daily news, as Lisa knows, is so different. Being married to a reporter is almost like being a reporter. You have this the beeper. In the 90s, you know, my pager would be going off. Zzz, zzz. I'm sure some people in the room know that feeling. And your life is owned by the process, and it was all this cycle of now. It's the story of the day. It's hard to report in the New York Times on something that's brewing. It could be a risk a decade or two or three from now. That's hard to fit into this ecosystem. So I became kind of frustrated with aspects of that, even as I was reporting about the treaty negotiations and doing investigative stories on, at that time, the Bush administration was muzzling EPA and NASA scientists, kind of like it's been happening lately. I went to the North Pole and other amazing places. And then, as I said, this is another view of the North Pole. That water is 14,000 feet deep. And these cracks were forming under our feet. So my previous book was called The North Pole Was Here. It was about the evanescence of the Arctic ice scape. This was ice ridging. These big flows of ice that we were camped on kind of push into each other.
You can feel the chunk that we're on actually starting to fail a bit more. Probably hairline cracks up towards the helos there.
So does that mean we should back up?
Should we back up?
Not yet. You could always jump over a crack.
So he told me you could always jump over a crack. And I wasn't comforted by that. He'd been up on the sea ice of the Arctic many more times. I was just there for 3 days, so it was a very weird experience. But again, this was leading me to this world of two-way journalism. That same fall, I went to the North Slope of Alaska in the middle of the winter, actually, December, to report on changes in the tundra. And I did a kind of a podcast. It was part of that story. And then in the spring of the following year, 2004, I went to Greenland and really wrote a blog. I was writing a bigger piece for the paper, but then I wrote a daily dispatches called Postcards from the Arctic, which felt more and more like a good way to tell stories. And then finally in 2007, I started my blog at the time, Snot Earth. And it wasn't like some editor said, hey, Andy, we need a sustainability blog. I just felt the issues surrounding climate change were so variegated. It's politics, it's behavior, technology, climate science, all in one story. And there was no way to get that into a conventional news account that captured the full dimensions of the issue. And I started the blog to kind of fill in the blanks. And also the blog had comments, some of which were not constructive. And if you engage on any social media platform, you have to kind of find a way to to foster good behavior. It's kind of like dog training. I've learned rewarding good behavior is a better path to progress than trying to punish bad behavior, which just tends to inflame people and make them even worse. And so I wrote 2,810 pieces on .earth in the next 9 years. And I vetted 100,000 comments, which is, some people would say, what are you, nuts? But it led me to whole new ways, listening to my readers, some of whom were experts too, but some of whom were like an American expatriate living in the Amazon, who was very good writer, and I gave him the helm. I posted some of his comments as pieces because he was so interesting. The blog was a platform not just for my ideas; it was for my posse. A community I was building around the world, which was really exciting. But then the realities of online communication are tough. This is just blogs about climate, and there's one for everybody. If you have your uncle who's complete denial about anything about climate, or your cousin who, someone who's totally clean energy, or someone who thinks only nuclear power can fill the gaps we have, you can find your food, you can find your information to suit your preferences in this environment. So that became kind of dispiriting. The downside of there's an amazing upside to global connectivity and the internet and social media, but it can be swamped and you can be deafened by the noise and just worn down by it as well. At Columbia University, I'm working on to try to foster practices in students and faculty, and then in a community around the world, on how to work on the upside of all that connectivity to facilitate better outcomes and for disaster resilience or for climate choices, and to tamp down the dark side, and or at least recognize it. There are tools that can allow anyone to cut through the disinformation, and sometimes it's hard, but there's ways to do this. It involves training and sustained work. And I'm still writing. I just had a piece a month ago in the Times. The blog is not going right now. I'm trying to find a full-time place to write more regularly. I did a piece on Greta Thunberg's ocean crossing, drawing on some early experiences I had crossing an ocean. And at Columbia, this center that we have, as I said, that's a picture from a few weeks ago I took, where we had a room full of scientists and journalists hanging out, not to be interviewed as for a story, but to actually look at the climate question together informally, just chatting and brainstorming about fresh ways to tell stories related to climate change. And this is Lisa McKaylee, my wife, who works you'll hear from her when we do Q&A, who works with teachers to facilitate their capacity to build concepts into their daily lesson plans that relate to sustainability and pollution reduction and the like. So we're all in the same journey in many ways. The book came about, and we decided to collaborate because, again, Lisa's, a lot of her work has been in environmental education, and we both are into the history of ideas. And it's a journey, as I said, kind of a learning journey from the simple things like where did the barometer and the thermometer come from, to I loved this piece of art. It was a French newspaper in 1917, so around World War I, describing how winter was Russia's biggest ally. This is General Winter, le Général Hiver. So Russia's most powerful general was just really cold temperatures. And the book has a chapter showing how Hitler learned that lesson when he was trying to march into Russia late in the war, and his army was devastated. So it was a fascinating thing, especially having been writing about climate for 30 years. We kept learning new things, which is really cool. Here's just a few of my favorites. It turns out that in China and ancient Greece, they both started to it wasn't like they were talking to each other. There wasn't a lot of crosstalk between China and Greece in those days. But scholars in both places were zooming in on this idea that that nature being depicted as gods, there's something actually happening there. There was methodology and dynamics that were explicable. And Aristotle was saying, now the sun, moving as it does, sets up processes of change and becoming and decay, and by its agency, the finest and sweetest water is every day carried up and is dissolved into vapor and rises to the upper region, where it's condensed again by the cold and returns to earth. And in the year 100, the Common Era Wang Chang in China writes, as to this coming of rain from the mountains, some hold that the clouds carry the rain with them, dispersing as it is precipitated, and they are right. Clouds and rain are really the same thing. I love that. Water evaporating upwards becomes clouds, which condense into rain or still further into dew. It's just so cool to think that something about the human experience around that era was creating this common sense of moving past some of the old norms for how we thought about the natural world. Science was emerging. This guy, who I'd never heard of, go to Wikipedia, you can find out more. Shen Kuo was an amazing character. He was an inventor, an engineer, a politician. He was in charge of a district in China. And in his wanderings, he had gone to a town where a riverbank had collapsed. There was a landslide, and there was fossilized bamboo, petrified bamboo. And he didn't think about it much at the time, but years later, when he was writing his memoirs, he wrote, he was thinking about that because it was a part of China that does not have bamboo in the current time. And he said, well, under the ground, a forest of bamboo shoots was thus revealed. It contained several hundred bamboo with their roots and trunks all complete and turned to stone. Bamboos do not grow in Yanzhou. Perhaps in very ancient times, the climate was different, so that the place was low, damp, gloomy, and suitable for bamboo. And no one, all the scholars have probed history, and it seems like this is the first time anyone wrote in physical words that climate can change. The climate of a place now is not always the climate of that place. And you look back in Greek history and literature, and Chinese too, there was a sense of the climate system being turbulent and dynamic, but it wasn't changing. And this was so interesting to think about. And we went through all kinds, there's lots of stories in between. But thinking about what's going on in California right now, we think of the horrors that many people have faced. 85 people in Paradise, California, dying incinerated in their cars, trying to escape on inadequate roads and the like. But the worst fire in American history was in 1871, and it was in the Midwest, in Wisconsin. It wasn't in the West. And we think of this. And one reason it's sort of buried in history is because it happened the same week as the Great Chicago Fire. And most everyone knows about Mrs. O'Leary's cow or kicking over a lantern, but it turns out they were probably, that fire and this great forest fire, raging fire, were probably initiated by some similar weather events. It was dry and windy, and there was a lot of clearing going on. The lands around there were the trees were all being cut. There was a lot of burning going on of brush and stuff. And it was a devastating thing, killed, I think it was like 1,400 people. And this account of a reverend at the time who wrote a memoir about it is just so chilling. Basically, the banks of the river, as far as the eye could reach, were covered with people standing there, motionless as statues, some with eyes staring upward turned toward heaven and tongues protruded. I pushed the persons standing on each side of me into the water. One of these sprang back again with a half-smothered cry, murmuring, I am wet, but immersion in water was better than immersion in fire. Remarkable a bit of history that, again, it's worth resurfacing some of these things. So we think about scale and current events, casting them against history is important to me. And then there's this, wind power is all around us now. And you think of it as a new technology, but it's not remotely new. Of course, anyone who's been to the Netherlands, you've seen windmills going back to, there's windmills actually in the Middle East that go back a couple of thousand years at least, for pumping water. But there was a guy in Ohio, in Cleveland, who built that in his backyard in 1887. And there was another, that same year, a quirky engineer in Scotland did a much smaller version. This guy was sort of the Thomas Edison of Cleveland. And he had already become wealthy. He invented dynamos, which can transfer physical energy into electricity, a generator. And he created his own little power supply. Look at, do you see the people? Here's a person. I mean, that's astonishing. Doesn't exist anymore. You can find out more about it in the book. And these are wind turbines in Europe that I photographed from an airplane. So it's just remarkable. And I loved the chapter on the invention of air conditioning. The ancient Romans had slaves go up into the mountains and bring back snow and ice to their Roman mansions to cool the walls. So air conditioning has existed off and on. There was a physician in Florida who did the same thing with a trainload of ice brought down to a hospital to cool the hospital. But it was really 1902 when a young engineer named Carrier, his last name, someone here probably has a Carrier air conditioner today, he was assigned to figure out what was going on in a printing plant in Brooklyn, where the ink was running. The air was so humid in the summertime that they couldn't print effectively. He came out with a dehumidifier, which was the prototypical air conditioner. And when they were marketing this in the 20s, they called it manufactured weather. And it's probably one of the single most transformative changes in our relationship with weather has been air conditioning. A big chunk of the South, big chunk of the developing world is virtually uninhabitable in a functional way without air conditioning. It changed landscapes. The Saturday matinees of the 30s and 40s in theaters were only possible because there were air conditioning. Refrigerating plant, it says in the lobby of that hotel. And the portable window version was revolutionary as well. And then carbon dioxide and climate, turned out that LBJ in 1965 requested a report on the environment from the academies of science and other scientific agencies of the government. And so even in 1965, this is before this issue became in the news, he said something really interesting. He said at that time they were negotiating over the first versions of the Clean Air Act. This was not about climate, but about conventional smog and pollution. It should be improved to investigate potential air pollution problems before pollution happens, rather than having to wait until the damage occurs. That was so interesting to me. It's like anticipatory governance. It's so rare now. You think about, we only seem to really dig in on problems, whether it's the national debt or some economic issue or something like climate. And we wait until it's already underway before we act. And it was really neat to see that there was a time when there was an anticipatory interest, and that same report had this section on climatic changes that may be produced by the increase in carbon dioxide content, could be deleterious from the point of view of human beings. And of course that built into a much more profound picture of change and risk in the next couple of decades. 1988, as I said earlier, that cover story of mine was that year. That was the year Jim Hansen, who was a NASA scientist, testified pretty aggressively that climate change from carbon dioxide concentrations rising was already discernible to him at that point. He was an outlier then, and now, again, the science has been reinforced. That was the year that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was created. And that was the year I went to Toronto to what was at that time the first international conference on the changing atmosphere was that year. And it was all sort of leading up to 1991, 1992, the Earth Summit, the trajectory toward having the need for an agreement that Ted got involved with, the newspaper he was publishing during the Earth Summit, and the like, all built from this body of science that emerged at that time. And now, we're locked into still some levels of debate on this issue, and it can feel pretty dispiriting because people get sort of immediately drawn to their corners. You're either a believer or denier, an alarmist or whatever. We're tossing labels around. And what gets missed in all that is the fundamental facts of the science often are almost irrelevant to those arguments. And I started to dig in more on the behavioral science around climate change. Around 2006, I wrote a piece for the Times called Yelling Fire on a Hot Planet. It's very easy to Google for. So just Google for Revkin climate yelling fire. And that was the first time. I'd already been writing about climate for 18 years. And that was the first time I ever interviewed a behavioral scientist, like a psychologist or sociologist. And it was devastating because there's all the science, actual science, not climate science, but psychology saying that, well, a lot of the time, when an issue is heated and contentious, more information doesn't help. It actually can hinder progress. People get more dug in. There have been studies on vaccination showing that presenting someone who's emotionally against vaccinating kids, if you present them with more studies showing the efficacy of doing that, it makes them more resistant to vaccination. And that, as a journalist, that felt existential, like, oh my God, what? Am I going to spend the next 20 years of my life writing prize-winning stories for the New York Times on stuff and knowing it doesn't change people? So it got me much more focused on thinking through more clearly how people receive or reject information, that's one reason I ended up at Pace University. My title there was Senior Fellow for Environmental Understanding. It wasn't Senior Fellow for Environmental Storytelling, because I was kind of trying to get my head again around the bigger picture. And it was that kind of interest of mine, the learning I did then, led me more and more to people like Ted Keel, because for decades he had been figuring out how to deal with divergent opinions and heated arguments about, the mass transit unions in New York City and Mayor Lindsay, that kind of stuff. And if he could work his way through those landscapes of dispute, it felt useful to talk to him about these. And he and I never got to do this. I wanted to convene kind of a dispute resolution climate meeting where Ted would help to shape the discussion. We didn't get to that point, but he sits in my head quite a bit thinking about those things. And Dan Kahane is a Yale Law School. He's actually got a background in behavioral science as well as law. And he summarized this pretty well. He does this work he calls cultural cognition. And one of the chapters in the book is on this. He says, what you believe about climate change does not reflect what you know. It expresses who you are. And it's really an important learning to get that clear in one's head before entering into an argument with somebody about what they do or don't know about climate change, or what they think about nuclear power or the like. And I've met plenty of people, like here, I got to interview Bill Gates for an hour in 2016 in his at his foundation, the Gates Foundation in Seattle. And see, I'm showing him my 1985 nuclear winter cover story, which was pretty fun. But I couldn't get him to budge on, he has a very particular vision of the climate problem in his head, and the solutions are mostly about big advances in nuclear zero emission technology or big research breakthroughs on capturing carbon. And that's where he's investing. And I was trying to describe for him situations I've seen in developing countries at the village level where there's some interesting innovations related to renewable energy. But Bill's he's got his vision, and that's fine. We need him with his singular approach to his investments. And Jim Hansen, the scientist who testified and has been such an active presence in climate campaigns for decades, and Bill McKibben, both here marching for climate action. The two of them have completely different views of climate success. Jim Hansen thinks only nuclear power has the scale to decarbonize the world economy, and there's deep flaws in that argument that I can see, but I don't think if you cross off nuclear, you're missing an opportunity as well. And Bill McKibben is not pro-nuclear remotely. He's about small distributed energy, but they march together. Sometimes they actually chain themselves to the White House fence together. So somehow or other, they figured out how to have different views of the path to success, but to actually work together constructively. And too often in this arena, I see people, even if you get past the question about is global warming happening or not, who end up in these fights with each other over what do we do? And finding ways forward that involve tolerance and action seems vital. And then there's geoengineering is another part of the book. Along with weather modification, there's a chapter on the early history of changing the weather as humans using silver, oh my gosh. There's particles that silver iodide. Yeah, you can seed clouds. You can absolutely make clouds by throwing silver iodide out of an airplane. But how that actually changes the weather is still deeply unclear whether it's beneficial. There's a couple $2 billion is spent every year in China and here in the Midwest on trying to create rain, but it's not clear it works. And then there's geoengineering, which is this idea that on a global scale, if we could just become like a volcano, volcanoes absolutely can cool the climate. That was Pinatubo erupting in 1991 in the Philippines, markedly cooled the climate of the world for several years because some of that cloud of sulfurous stuff got way up into the stratosphere. The question is, can we do that, or should we do that as people? Can we intentionally add sulfur to the stratosphere as a way to block sunlight and turn down the thermostat a little bit as a counterweight to global warming? It's a very complicated arena. I'm absolutely for the research in that arena, but I don't see a path toward doing it at the global scale anytime soon. but it's one of these challenges we face as we head toward, remember, we've been on this journey from like a one-way relationship with climate toward recognizing we're a global influence, toward what do we do about it, and we know that we're not going to remotely come close to shutting down global industry. So is this something we should think about as well going forward? We should absolutely think about it. Whether we do it is a whole nother question. And how do you end a book on our relationship with climate and weather? Well, we decided to cast forward 100,000 years in history. So what's the climate of the year 1218? And it's, again, whether or not we do that geoengineering stuff in the short term, I think it's pretty clear that if we maintain technological capacity as societies and scientific capacity, once the next ice age cycle is looming, we will choose not to have another mile of ice coming toward us here in the Hudson Valley or here in Pennsylvania, right? We're not going to just sort of sit back. So I think we're heading toward having a managed relationship with the climate system going forward, one way or the other. That's way beyond the lifetimes of people in this room, but it's something to think about. And it felt like a fun way to end the book with a question mark. And then pulling back as far as we can pull back, this is Cassini photograph from behind Saturn looking back at us. That's us. And boy, I do love space science. We're getting this view of our journey that includes being humble about it. Even as at the planet scale, we're huge. At the solar system scale, we are minuscule. And thinking about that as we go forward is really important. So thank you very much. And Lisa is we're happy to answer any questions and talk to you for a while if we have time. Thank you. Any questions? Oh, yeah.
Questions for Andy?
So you had bad flooding here. When was it, the flooding? 2004, 5, and 6. Wow.
3 times in 22 months.
Wow.
Yeah. The downtown was underwater.
Wow.
Yeah. It was transformative, I think, for the community's understanding of its relationship to weather.
Yeah, and there have been these incidents like that, Nashville and West Virginia. One of the pretty powerfully understood consequences in a warming climate is heavier downpours. It doesn't mean we're already there. It doesn't mean that every time there's a heavy rain that global warming is to blame, but it means in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, I wrote about this for the Times, 2014 or 15? 3 or 4 years ago, they had 40 inches of rain in like 2 days, and absolutely devastating. That's a lot of rain. And you know, that's the kind of thing, it's harder to see how we'll be avoiding more incidents like that. As the atmosphere warms, it holds more water vapor. So when the conditions are right for rain, there's more rainfall. So resilience, and I know you're doing projects here on resilience, is job one for sure. Whatever you think about global warming, resilience to hazards like flooding and drought and wildfire in the West is a crucial part of what has to happen with urgency right now. Yeah. You think about global warming, and everyone's been waiting for a treaty, right? We just need those people to figure out a treaty or something. I lost confidence in that model a long time ago. And there's an agreement, the Paris Agreement, under the treaty that was forged in 1992. But the Paris Agreement was a success because it's flexible. It doesn't have hard timetables and targets. The only way to get 200 countries to agree on anything, and it took 25 years of diplomacy to figure out this no-brainer, is to make it non-binding. And so that leads back to the local level. You know, what are we going to do with our energy norms? How can we make our villages and towns resilient to weather extremes? And also at the federal level, what can we do to rationalize flood insurance, which is such a broken system in our country? It was too cheap. And then the one effort to make it more rationally expensive to live in a floodplain has faltered as well. And those are solutions that can grow from the local. And I'll just give you an example. We were talking about at lunch earlier. In the Midwest, there's a organization called the Jefferson Center, which is many decades old and they design what they call deliberative democracy exercises, where you get a community together and talk about a big issue. And they've been doing what they call rural climate dialogues. So if you Google, I can't say that word, Google for rural climate dialogues and Jefferson Center, you'll see there's a template that's emerged for how to have a discussion on how to foster resilience. At Columbia University, we just had a meeting in end of August, or somewhere, the last few months, on managed retreat, the concept of managed retreat, which is mostly about coastal issues, where communities from the lower part of the Delaware Valley, the Chesapeake, to basically everywhere on the planet on a coastline, communities have to learn how to pull back from areas where the hazard will just be ever more intense, because sea levels are rising for centuries to come. It's a given, it's a done thing. And the only question is how fast. And so how do you normalize conversations about that when mayors don't want to admit that the shoreline of today's city isn't going to be the shoreline of tomorrow's city? And I criticized Mayor Bloomberg a few years ago when he had a big speech on climate change adaptation, but he said, we will not retreat. He said, our New York City's shoreline is its most valuable asset. I'm like, that's denial. It's a form of climate denial. So these are the things that are actionable at the local level. New York City right now is trying to figure out how to modernize buildings. There are 1 million buildings in New York City, and nothing about federal policy or the climate treaty is going to affect how that's done on the ground in New York City. And so those are all local issues with lots of ways to go forward. Yeah. Yeah. If you couldn't hear, he was asking about some discussions of geoengineering, the sulfur stuff, the solar sunshade. It's super cheap. It's way cheaper than decarbonizing global energy systems, which is a multi-trillion-dollar thing. And actually, back in the 80s, a scientist, Edward Teller, who's very famous, he had a voice like this, and he was the model for the guy in the Peter Sellers movie, Dr. Strangelove. He wasn't in a wheelchair, but no, he said, all you need is he had like a number of 14 707s flying 24 hours a day, just put out a couple 100,000 tons of sulfur, and so it's cheap. It's totally cheap. But then comes the question of this unilateral question. I've been looking at this a lot, and I still see no scenario where either a trillionaire like Bezos or a single country will find it in its national interest to do a global atmospheric intervention. Because geoengineering only works globally. As I was saying earlier, weather modification, which still doesn't clear, you can make rain in a consistent way. The idea that some individual or some single country will say it's worth nudging the entire global climate through releasing cheaply a small amount of sulfur for the sake of what you could do locally with agricultural innovation or something. So it just feels like there's no there. I don't see it. I may be wrong. But Qatar, but there was just a great story in the Washington Post. Qatar, as they pronounce Qatar in the Persian Gulf, they're air conditioning the outside world now. They're actually, look for air conditioning and QATAR, Washington Post story just a week ago. They can do local interventions. We were in Singapore a few years ago. Anyone been to Singapore, the gardens by the bay? They have these giant glass botanical gardens. It was so jarring for me to be 80 miles from the equator, steamy tropical heat, and you walk into the botanical gardens, Mediterranean environment globe, and we're talking, they're huge. And it's like 70 degrees, and there's oregano bushes and olive trees 80 miles from the equator. So again, there's so much you could do locally that I just don't see it happening. The Sultan of Brunei or anybody. Maybe, and again, I might be wrong, but someone has to show me a case where that could happen. I'll be talking about that in December at a big science meeting on climate and security, so I'll let you know what comes of that. But there was other questions.
Just wondering, piggyback on that, unintended consequences could be also pretty big.
Oh, from geoengineering. Yeah.
Breathing this stuff, and it's hard to collect it once you've deployed it, and will we need to collect it? When is it overkill? So my question was, I think there's two issues that I have with a lot of this stuff, which is unintended consequences and scalability.
Yeah.
All these alternative forms I mentioned, including wind, the scalability to 7 billion people's needs. Is anybody doing research
Yeah.
on this stuff? Like, okay, how many windmills? And if you do, doesn't that disrupt weather too? And would that
Yeah.
be a problem too? And same thing with wave technology. Same thing with birds, cancer.
Yeah. Yeah, no, scale. The words that hang in my head every day as a journalist, or one of them is scale. Absolutely. And it's the word gigaton it sits there, which is 1 billion tons. 1 billion tons, we're now pumping out 40 billion tons of CO2 a year, 40 billion tons of this gas. And even if we all globally reduce our emissions to the level that China is at to now, which is 6 tons per person per year, that would actually be amazing, because we're at 17 tons per person per year here right now. Europe's about 6. China's come up to 6, which is part of their modernization of their economy. India is less than 2 tons per person per year. So 9 billion people times 6 tons per person is still 54 billion tons of CO2 a year by 2050. So that's like, oh my God. So that's on the emissions side. And on these interventions, agricultural productivity, if you're reducing sunlight, photosynthesis relies on sunlight. There's no, the scale issue and a massive wind. There was just a study that just 2 days ago, I think, there was a new analysis of offshore wind can produce a huge amount of electricity. But the big buts are, even the United States, well, Bobby Kennedy, the Kennedys were fighting offshore wind off of the Cape Cod for 20 years, and they're all green champions, and we don't like the backyard stuff, even if it's offshore. Having it play out, having that built, it's quicker to build wind than it is to build a nuclear power plant, and that has its own issues with community acceptance.
Let's say you have if you scale it up.
Yeah.
Say there aren't these issues, and you have whole oceans full of just windmills because we have so many billions of people.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be also possibly detrimental to weather?
Oh yeah.
So
People are modeling that too.
all that to create 50 others. That's the question.
Yeah, and someone mentioned birds. Birds and windmills are not happy bedfellows, and bats too. So no, there's all trade-offs for everything we do, and which is one reason why I take seriously the scientific push to get carbon dioxide out of the air and put it away. It has its own scale issues. They're huge. To do that at gigaton scale is an enormous undertaking. But then you're not the secondary consequences of taking away the heat trapping gas are much more about any local impact. Like if you liquefy it and put it in the ground, you have the questions about would it come back out of the ground, but it's not like you're intervening in a way that's adding a nudge to the atmosphere. And yeah, I know I've seen studies about if you had, millions of windmills, how would that affect air circulation and the like. It's work that's being done. I'd have to dig in myself to answer the question fully. By the way, all of this gets at the sort of, the one thing I recoil at is binary arguments, yes, no. This is an and issue. We need to research geoengineering, and we need to work much more aggressively to figure out how you can have a policy pushing us more rapidly away from fossil fuels. It's like, we live in the world has had the same rough percentage of fossil fuel use for 40 years now. It's still about 80% or more of the global primary energy, meaning energy for manufacturing, for moving vehicles. The whole menu of energy for any particular year for human beings on the planet is still more than 80% fossil. And it's been 80% fossil since like the 70s. And the reason it hasn't nudged is because we've added wind, and we added a significant amount of nuclear power. We've added some hydro in the recent decades, but it's mostly been on top of the other fossil fuel use. It's not taking away fossil fuel use. This is what happened in Germany. They did a great push on solar, and they helped to energize the solar industry by having subsidies for solar. But Germany still drives on the Autobahn at 160 miles an hour in their Porsches, and they haven't nudged their oil use at all, and they still rely heavily on coal, and it's the worst kind of coal in Germany. It's this brown coal, more polluting. So they're turning off their nuclear power plants because the people are opposed to nuclear. So it hasn't actually changed their fossil profile markedly. It's a big challenge.
But you met Greta. You talked to Greta.
I haven't interviewed her. I was with her, yeah.
But you seem to be hopeful, and sort of the younger generation seems to be really like Cassini.
Yeah. Could you come up here, honey?
And on a humble
No, just about young people, the role of young people, generally. Miss Educator.
Why don't you answer?
Well, I have my own my thinking is I'm enthusiastic about the engagement for sure right now. I profiled youth climate activists in 2005 at the climate talks in Montreal, and they're very much like the Gretas of today. They were a little older. They're more like 20, in their 20s. And many of them, these young idealists I met in the hallways at the treaty conference in 2005 with signs and, doing sit-ins and sleep-ins, are now working in, one guy is running a company that finances solar installations on low-income housing in California, Billy Parrish. Another is working, he runs the Sierra Club in Maryland. So they had that pulse of zeal and in-your-face activism that they've turned into careers. That's fantastic. The one thing I would love to see right now is for the Fridays for the Future movement, the street protests, to go back into the schools. And on Twitter, a hashtag is a word with a pound sign in front of it for anyone who's not on social media. And I've been using the hashtag Occupy the Curriculum, meaning if you're in a university and you're getting an MBA and they're only teaching you the efficiency part of Adam Smith, meaning, this is production, and they're not teaching you that he was a moral philosopher, and there's a moral sentiments part of Adam Smith's writing from the 1700s that's about the other side of production and the impacts on workers, then you're not fully teaching economics. And so that would be an Occupy the Curriculum thing at the university level. And at the high school level, as Lisa has been doing with students, you can measure the pollution of the buses coming into your school. You can put that on the internet, and you can say the air in our part of New York City is dirtier than the air in the Upper East Side. What's wrong with that? Why is that? So you can directly engage with problems and help to use the learning process as a doing process as well. And then it feels like a full dimension kind of activism. So that's sort of where I come down. And at Columbia, I'm developed one of the courses I'll be teaching in the spring is sort of a communication lab for the master's degree students studying sustainability. It's how to test drive ways to use communication tools we're surrounded by to have more progress. And you have to describe what self does. So if you come up here. May I ask you a question, Lisa? Lisa helps teach teachers.
Thank you. No, my work is with sustainability education. So I work with teachers to bring the environmental integrity, social equity, and economic vitality. Those are the three pillars of sustainability education. So to bring those into, that's the kind of work that I do. So climate change and students is one aspect of it. Andy works more directly with students who are invested in climate change. But our work is more in terms of helping teachers to embrace models like project-based learning and place-based learning so that students are involved in their local community and taking action on issues that are important to them in their community. So that's my thing.
Which, and that seems pretty in sync with some of the stuff we've been learning that Nurture Nature does too. Any other questions? Yeah?
How do you generally respond to people who don't acknowledge the existence of the issue? Like, do you have a default, well, here's where you should?
Yeah. Well, I usually start by agreeing with them on several things. One of which is I think there's been a lot of overstatement. And one of which is that there's actually a lot more uncertainty in this picture than some people have conveyed. In fact, one of the most powerfully understood realities of climate change is we don't know how hot it's going to get. We know we don't know whether it's going to be truly catastrophic or manageable. And that range of uncertainty this is if you double the amount of CO2 in the air from the amount that was there before the Industrial Revolution, 280 parts per million. So you go to twice that. And that could still be 1 degree centigrade or 5 degrees centigrade let's say by 2100. And so that's the difference between catastrophe and something manageable for sure. And the science looks unlikely to make it clearer anytime soon. So when someone says, oh, they're saying there's only 12 years left, they're wrong. The person criticizing that would be correct. And that's the other thing. There's 12 years left if we want to have a serious effort get going on reducing CO2 in the atmosphere. But there's no one on the planet that I know who sees any way we can't meaningfully cut emissions globally anywhere near what some of these imagined trajectories are. So I start with agreeing on some of those basic things. And then the other thing is I really just try to listen a lot as much as I can. And there's a great little video on YouTube. A CNN reporter went to Woodward County, Oklahoma in 2015, which at that time had been identified in a Yale survey as the most skeptical county in America on global warming. I mean, it's the oil patch, right? It's Inhofe country. And he did these interviews with people there, just like, what do you think about weather? What do you think about climate? And find this video, just Woodward County CNN climate. It's amazing because there's a guy who works for an oil company and he's kind of like, he says, well, God controls the environment. And turns out he's a creationist. He paid to have these like dinosaurs with people riding them sort of in the playground in the town. So science is not in the foreground in this guy's life, right? But then he says we're going to get off the grid entirely. We have half of our roof covered with solar panels, and we plan to get off the grid entirely. And you're thinking, okay, that's interesting. And it turns out the reason he wants to get off the grid is because he's libertarian. He doesn't want to, he's a total hardcore conservative. He's self-reliant. Why would I pay someone money to generate electricity for me when I can create it myself? So the lesson there is if you go into Woodward County, Oklahoma with a climate crisis sign, you're alienating a guy who's your ally on a post-carbon energy system, right? And that's what, so, and this gets to what I was saying about, Bill McKibben and Jim Hansen. If I got them into a bar and forced them to talk about nuclear and renewables, they would have a real bad fight. But they have found a way, at least in public, to, even within, they're deeply interested in saving the world from a bad climate outcome, but they have their different visions. So figuring that out is really important. And it usually involves active listening. It's like just, and it's not just strategic, it's just reality. The other thing that I learned about, one of the things I learned about that was really valuable is it's science. It's actually rational to be irrational, which sounds weird. But think back, so let's go back to 1 million years ago. We're on the Serengeti, and someone in the room who here is like adventurous, who goes out on weird trips. Okay, so you've gone somewhere, right? And you've gone out and walkabout, and you saw the sun set in a weird way, and you come back and you say, wow, I think we're wrong about God. Is that smart? To come back with a new paradigm for how the world works, back to the fire where everyone is sitting there with one belief? No, it's not smart. Evolution would say it's actually rational, it's adaptive to be irrational, meaning to just hew to a belief rather than to think about science. And that gives me some comfort level with going into a room and being sure to listen, because it's like, it's the way we are to a certain extent. Diversity of views is not just cultural and political. Some of it's just part of us, and getting comfortable with that is important.
Is there a future for nuclear energy? My first question. My second question is, what is Revkin music?
Oh, yeah, I didn't bring my guitar. Now I'm a songwriter and a performer too. I used to play with Pete Seeger for 20 years. We live in the Hudson Valley, really close to him. So I answered the second question first. Oh, wait, say it again? What's so bad about that? Oh, I'll have to look it up. Well, he wrote, Tom Paxton wrote the fantastic song in a bus heading to the first Earth Day celebration, Whose Garden Was This?, which is one of my all-time favorite songs on the environment. Yeah, I have a song called Liberated Carbon. No, nuclear power, whether anyone in this room likes it or not, nuclear power is moving ahead. Russia just launched a floating nuclear reactor power plant that's going up to the Northern Sea route to power their offshore oil industry with electricity. South Korea, China, everyone, there are many countries moving ahead with nuclear technology. There are some young entrepreneurs here, and Bill Gates, who are still pursuing what's called small modular systems. It's like the antithesis of the nuclear power plants we came of age with from the 60s onward, which were essentially an oversized submarine power plant that came out on land and have all kinds of issues, waste. The new ones, some of the new designs won't have those issues. One of the big debates right now is what do we do with today's fleet that was more than 100 operating power plants. We're down to about 90 now in the country. It's still 20% of our electricity is nuclear, and it's going to go down and down and down. Every time Vermont and New Hampshire decommissioning today's fleet of nuclear power plants more rapidly than we might otherwise do is reducing renewable energy. And if someone has a strategy for zooming renewables forward to fill that gap, that's great, but it's a big gap. And personally, I think finding ways to sustain the use of today's existing plants, the ones that are reliable, is a crucial part of a serious climate strategy. And that's separate from the future. We want new designs. So those are the two. This gets back to the conversation thing. Any discussion of nuclear to me starts with two questions. What do you want to do with existing plants? And do you have any vision of nuclear playing a role going forward? At least that feels like a reality-based. They're very different questions, and they can be, then you can get someone talking. And music is really fun. It's a fun way. It's also, I have bandmates that I play with who disagree with me completely on natural gas and nuclear, but we play music together, and we, my wife has a different view of our local Indian Point power plant than I do. We still love each other. So it's like, there's ways to figure this out.
We'll take one more question, and then he'll be here for signing, too. So
Yeah.
books are available right by the elevator if you want to buy one, and then we'll have signing over here so we can keep talking to him. We're not going to let him go right away.
Yeah.
You say that the certainty of this overstatement of the problem, the certainty is overstated perhaps, but not necessarily the problem because they don't know for sure, so maybe it's not even
Well, yeah.
overstated.
Well, right. No, but and that sounds subtle. No, but you're totally right. The profound reality is because of CO2 being a cumulative gas, long-lived gas, the decisions or indecision in the next 10, 20 years will have an imprint on the planet's climate for thousands of years. It's actually tens of thousands of years, including in sea level rise. There's a chapter in the book on this as well, where our choices for the future are not no sea level rise or flood, epic Noah flood. It's a range of sea level rise, but the low end is still probably 5 meters within 1,000 years, which is a long period of time. Sea level today, it'll be at least 2 or 3 meters above today's sea level. And that means fundamentally transformed coastlines. But on this weird time scale and the hardest thing to know is how fast that happens. I've been in Greenland, and I was just at a meeting at the University of Vermont 2 days ago with scientists studying both ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica. And the dynamics, it's like the best analogy I came up with this certainty thing is we're standing on a hill in San Francisco, and there's a school bus that's parked and starting to roll down the hill. And do you argue about how fast it's going? Or do you understand physics? And the physics means, oh my God, stop the frickin' bus. What can we do? And, you know, is it 1 mile an hour or 2 miles an hour? It's kind of like, oh, well, you know, arguing about are we going to have 1 or 2 meters of sea level rise by 2100? That's deeply uncertain. The certainty is in the long picture, and it's a fundamentally transformed Earth system for thousands of years to come. And that has an ethical weight to it, because right now the same thing is for biological diversity. The impacts we're having on the planet's biological systems right now will obviously, extinction is forever, right? So there's going to be this pulse of impacts in the living world that are going to be profound going forward for millions of years, which makes it a really weird moment. This Anthropocene is really weird, but it's not the stuff out your window, meaning the California fires. The drivers of the threat there are because so many people have built their houses in woods. They're going to burn. And they're burning now because it was hot and dry and windy. They're going to burn, period. And in California, I tweeted about this recently. They're adding 650,000 houses in areas that are already mapped as severe wildfire risk right now. And that's by 2050. To me, that's the urgent thing. You know, as I was saying with resilience, communities own that part of this. And that's something you can work on right now. So that's, I hope that helps. Thank you all for being here today.